It all began with something as simple as an empty stretch of land that had quietly belonged to my family for generations, 75 acres of untouched rolling hills just outside a small but fast-growing town. I'd inherited it from my parents after they passed, and though I didn't live there, I kept it maintained, paid my taxes, and treated it like sacred ground, the one peaceful place I had left. One morning, however, I decided to drive out there to clear some brush before winter and found something that stopped my heart cold: bulldozers. Real, heavy-duty, full-size construction machines cutting through my tree line like it was city property. Orange flags marked the soil, survey stakes stuck out of the ground, men in safety vests shouted over the noise of diesel engines. And right where my no trespassing sign used to be, a giant piece of chain hung snapped and dangling in the dirt. For a second, I thought maybe I'd taken a wrong turn, but no. It was my property, the same hilltop view, the same fence post my father hammered in 40 years ago. So I got out, waved to one of the workers, and shouted, "Hey, what's all this?" The man barely looked up and said casually, "Subdivision, Oak Ridge Meadows, Phase 1. You must be one of the landscape guys." That sentence hit me like a brick. Subdivision on my land? I looked around and realized they weren't just grading roads. They were laying out entire neighborhoods. I drove through the trails that used to cut across the property, and everywhere I looked, there was destruction: trenches, piles of cut timber, sewer pipes stacked like bones. The final insult was a big sign near the main road that read Oak Ridge Meadows, luxury homes, starting at $500,000, HOA managed community. My blood ran hot the moment I saw it. The Oak Ridge HOA was notorious in this region, a greedy, lawsuit-happy machine that had bought up half the southern edge of the county and transformed farmland into endless rows of gray, identical houses. And now they had somehow crossed my boundary line. I dug through my truck until I found the old framed survey map my dad had kept, and when I compared it to the signpost location, I realized they hadn't just crossed a few feet. They had taken roughly 20 acres of my land. Furious, I drove straight to the construction trailer near the site entrance and stormed inside. A guy in a white shirt, sunglasses, and too much cologne looked up from his laptop and asked, "Can I help you?" "Yeah," I said, slapping the survey map on his desk. "You're building on my property." He smirked like I'd just told him I owned the moon. "Sir, this land belongs to Oak Ridge Development. We have all our permits in order." "No, you don't," I said, my voice rising. "That line right there," I pointed, "is my boundary. You're almost half a mile past it." He shrugged, sipping his coffee. "If that's true, you'll have to take it up with the county. We're just contractors." The casual arrogance in his tone nearly made me lose it. "Your company broke my gate, bulldozed my field, and you call that a paperwork issue?" He leaned back in his chair, finally giving me a glance over his sunglasses. "Look, old-timer, I don't know what kind of outdated map you're holding, but this project's been cleared by the county, the state, and the HOA board. Either get on board or get a lawyer." I walked out before I punched the smugness off his face, but that sentence stayed with me. Get a lawyer. Over the next few weeks, I did just that. I called the county zoning office, the assessor's department, even the planning commission, but every official I spoke to gave me the same useless answer. The subdivision had been approved according to modern GIS mapping. When I showed them my deed, they said, "That old survey isn't in our system." They'd basically buried the truth under paperwork. My first lawyer told me it was a complicated case that could take years and cost me a fortune, suggesting I sell what was left of the property for a fraction of its value. I realized then I needed someone tougher. That's when I met Lydia Grant, an attorney who didn't scare easily. She studied my documents carefully, cross-referenced the coordinates, and finally looked up with a calm certainty that almost made me smile. "They built on your land," she said. "No question about it." "So we sue?" I asked eagerly. "Not yet," she replied. "Let them keep building." I frowned. "Why?" "Because the more they build, the more they owe," she explained. "If we stop them now, they'll claim it was a simple mistake and offer a small settlement. But if we wait until they've sunk millions into those homes, we'll own their entire development. Patience is power." Her logic made sense in a ruthless way. So I did what she said? I waited. For almost a year, I let the HOA build, pave, and expand across land they didn't own. I visited the site every few weeks, disguised as a curious local, watching the roads form and the model homes rise from what used to be my family's field. By the following spring, it was practically a new town. 96 homes, driveways, sidewalks, mailboxes, even playgrounds, all on ground that legally belonged to me. I watched the HOA post newsletters bragging about their fastest-growing community and the local paper quoting their president, Robert Klein, calling it a triumph of modern development. The arrogance made my teeth grind, but I said nothing. Meanwhile, Lydia quietly filed small notices in the county's public records, technical filings most people would overlook, establishing proof that every single mortgage and sale sat on disputed property. The moment the last home was completed, Lydia called me. "It's time," she said, her voice sharp with satisfaction. "Time for what?" I asked, though I already knew. "For the HOA to finally meet the man who actually owns their neighborhood." When Lydia said, "It's time," I knew what that meant. Months of waiting had finally paid off, and the noose we'd quietly tied around the HOA's neck was ready to pull tight. We met early the next morning at her office, where she spread maps and copies of county filings across the table like she was preparing for battle. "We're not confronting them yet," she explained. "First, we'll send a certified notice to the HOA and every homeowner, officially informing them that their properties are built on disputed land. We'll give them 30 days to respond. They won't believe it, of course, and that's exactly what we want." I asked why, and she smirked. "Because the moment they deny it, they dig their own hole. They'll keep selling, keep signing mortgages, keep adding legal liability." I couldn't help but grin. For once, it felt like the law was on my side instead of ignoring me. Lydia mailed the notices that afternoon, and the silence that followed was almost eerie. A week later, I got the first reaction, a phone call from a furious man who identified himself as Robert Klein, the HOA president. "You're trying to scam my residents," he barked. "We have full legal title to this land." I replied calmly, "Then you won't mind proving it." There was a pause before he snapped, "Our lawyers will handle you," and hung up. 2 days later, a letter arrived from the HOA's legal team, full of pompous jargon accusing me of harassment, defamation, and attempting to extort the homeowners association through false claims of ownership. Lydia laughed out loud when she read it. "Perfect," she said. "Now they've acknowledged receipt of notice, which means they can't plead ignorance later." The next few weeks were quiet. Too quiet. Construction had officially ended, but trucks still came and went, finishing touches on the final homes. The new residents had no idea what was coming. They were too busy planting flowers and installing basketball hoops. I drove by occasionally, watching the tidy lawns take shape and thinking, you poor souls have no clue where you're standing. Then, on a warm afternoon in May, Lydia called me again. "We've got movement," she said. "The HOA filed a civil injunction claiming you're attempting to interfere with community operations." I frowned. "So they sued me?" "Exactly," she replied. "And that's what gives us the leverage. We'll counterclaim with the deed." She was almost gleeful. "They just opened the courtroom door for us." It felt strange walking into court that first day. Polished floors, murmuring lawyers, and rows of people who probably had no idea their homes might not legally exist. The HOA had packed the gallery with angry residents clutching copies of their mortgage papers like holy relics. Robert Klein sat front and center with his smirk still firmly in place. His attorney, a smug man named Charles Benton, strutted up to the bench and began his opening argument about frivolous claims by opportunistic individuals seeking financial gain. When it was Lydia's turn, she stood, calm and confident, and said only one thing. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to submit Exhibit A, the original deed to Parcel 113B, recorded in 1976, never transferred, never subdivided, and currently held by my client." The courtroom went silent as she placed the old document on the judge's desk. The judge frowned, flipping through it. "This appears to show ownership of the same parcel where Oak Ridge Meadows now sits," he said slowly. Benton scoffed. Outdated records, Your Honor. The developer purchased that land legally from the county 4 years ago. Lydia nodded politely. Then I'm sure the county can provide the documentation. She produced another set of papers, printouts, from the county's property archive showing a clerical error, from the original GIS conversion that had mislabeled my property as county reserve. It was a mistake that no one had ever corrected, and somehow that tiny digital oversight had allowed Oak Ridge Development to buy land that wasn't theirs. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Benton's face turned pink as Lydia continued. My client never sold his property. He paid taxes every year, maintained the land, and holds the continuous deed chain. Every home built on that land was done so illegally. The judge leaned back, eyebrows raised. That's a serious allegation, Ms. Grant. Not an allegation, Your Honor, it's a fact, she said. And here's the kicker. All 96 properties' mortgage filings reference the same incorrect parcel ID, meaning every homeowner's title is clouded. Legally, they're sitting on my client's land. For a moment, the room buzzed with whispers, and even Robert Klein's confident posture wavered. Benton sputtered something about administrative oversight and harmless error, but the judge wasn't buying it. He ordered a full review of the county land records and temporarily barred the HOA from selling or transferring any lots until the dispute was resolved. As we walked out, Lydia whispered, "Now we've got them frozen. No sales, no money flow, no escape." Over the next few months, the investigation turned into chaos for the HOA. The developer's investors panicked and pulled funding. Banks froze construction loans. Homeowners started demanding answers, some even threatening to sue the HOA themselves. Meanwhile, Lydia and I stayed quiet, gathering more proof. She uncovered emails between Oak Ridge Development and county officials, messages suggesting they knew about the mapping discrepancy, but ignored it because fixing it would delay construction and cost money. That was the smoking gun. Lydia's grin when she found it was pure victory. They knew, she said simply. They knew they were building on land that wasn't theirs. The next court hearing felt like a public execution. Reporters filled the benches, cameras waited outside. Benton tried one last desperate defense, claiming we'd waited too long to assert ownership, but Lydia shot back instantly. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to property fraud still in effect. The judge nodded, unimpressed with Benton's theatrics. "Mr. Hayes," he said, addressing me directly, "as it stands, the evidence shows you hold legal title to the property known as Oak Ridge Meadows. The court hereby recognizes your ownership until further ruling." I'll never forget the look on Robert Klein's face, the disbelief, the fury, the sudden realization that everything he'd built was balanced on stolen ground. We walked out into a swarm of reporters, flashbulbs going off, microphones shoved in my face. "Mr. Hayes, what will you do now?" one asked. I smiled slightly and said the line that would later end up on half the local news headlines. "I'm just letting them live on my land, for now." Lydia laughed the entire drive back to her office. "You just declared war," she said, shaking her head. And she was right. Because what came next wasn't just about land anymore. It was about pride, power, and the full weight of the HOA machine realizing they'd finally messed with the wrong man. The moment the court recognized my ownership, it felt like the mountain itself shifted under Oak Ridge Meadows. But instead of accepting defeat, the HOA decided to fight dirtier than ever. Within a week, anonymous complaints started flooding the county. Offices, claims that my land taxes were delinquent, that I was harassing residents, even that my deed had been fraudulently acquired. Lydia called me one evening and said, "They're playing the smear game. Don't react, not yet." Sure enough, the local paper ran an article 2 days later titled, "Property Dispute Threatens Community Stability," painting me as some kind of greedy recluse who was trying to extort innocent families. They quoted Robert Klein whining about how I was destroying the dream of homeownership for nearly 100 families. The comments online were brutal. Strangers called me a monster, a scammer, a land thief. But Lydia's voice on the phone stayed steady. "Let them talk. They're panicking. Every word they publish while the ruling stands will come back to bury them." What none of those people realized was that the longer this dragged on, the worse it got for the HOA. The court's freeze order meant they couldn't sell, lease, or even legally finance any more homes on the disputed land. Mortgage lenders began pulling out, fearing lawsuits. The developers' investors wanted their money back. And the county, terrified of being exposed for its negligence, started quietly deleting records from the GIS system. But Lydia was smarter than them. She had already downloaded and notarized every document, every timestamp, every transaction log. One afternoon, she called me with that same calm tone she used when something big was about to happen. "They just dug their own grave," she said. The county tried to alter the online map database to hide their mistake, but we caught them doing it in real time. I drove straight to her office, and she showed me screenshots comparing the old and new maps. The boundaries had been adjusted, conveniently pushing the Oak Ridge line 50 yards south onto what was undisputedly my land. "That's tampering with public records," Lydia said, her voice sharp. "A felony." She filed a federal complaint the same day. The county clerk's office went into full panic mode. Suddenly, local officials who'd ignored me for months were calling nonstop, offering amicable settlement discussions. Lydia told them all the same thing. "My client doesn't settle with thieves." A week later, I got my first personal taste of HOA intimidation. Two men in suits knocked on my door one evening, claiming to represent the Oak Ridge Homeowners Council. They weren't polite. One said, "You're ruining people's lives, Mr. Hayes. You think this will end well for you?" The other leaned in and muttered, "Be careful driving at night up here. Lots of deer on those roads." It wasn't a threat I took lightly. I called Lydia immediately and she said, "Perfect. Let's make them regret that." She filed a restraining order the next morning and copied every media outlet in the county. When the news broke that HOA representatives had tried to intimidate a private citizen involved in an active court case, the story flipped. Public sympathy began to turn. Local radio hosts who'd once called me a con artist were now questioning the HOA's tactics. Comment sections filled with phrases like, "Maybe that guy was right." Meanwhile, Lydia and I prepared our next move, what she called the hammer. "We're going to file for a quiet title action," she explained, "which means once the court rules, every one of those homeowners will have to pay you to stay on the land." I blinked. "You mean I could technically evict them?" "Legally, yes," she said. "Morally, that's up to you. But either way, the HOA will be forced to buy the land from you at fair market value or abandon their subdivision entirely." The idea sounded crazy, but it was airtight. Every home sat on my land. Every mortgage was technically void without my consent. Lydia estimated that the total property value exceeded $40 million. "They can either compensate you properly," she said, "or lose everything." The HOA must have caught wind of what was coming because a few days later, they called for an emergency community meeting and invited me to attend, though I knew invited wasn't the right word. Lydia insisted on going with me, along with a videographer she'd hired to record the whole thing for our records. When we arrived at the Oak Ridge clubhouse that evening, the parking lot was overflowing. Angry homeowners packed the hall, shouting before we even stepped inside. Robert Klein stood on the stage like a king addressing his subjects, pointing at me and yelling, "That man is trying to steal your homes." The crowd booed and hissed, some shouting threats. Lydia raised a hand and calmly said, "My client owns the land your houses sit on. The court has already recognized that. We're here to discuss solutions, not rumors." But reason didn't matter. One man shouted, "You'll never get a dime from us." Another yelled, "We'll sue you!" Lydia just smiled. "You can't sue the owner," she said simply, and the room fell into stunned silence. Then she reached into her briefcase and pulled out the big guns, a printed aerial photo showing every lot number overlaid with my original survey lines. Half the audience leaned forward. The other half looked sick. "Every red mark here," she said, "is built on property that doesn't belong to you." Someone near the back muttered, "Oh my God." Klein's face turned crimson. He snatched the papers from her hand and tried to tear them, but she already had 10 copies. "Those are now public record," she said firmly. "Destroying one won't change the truth." For a brief moment, the whole room froze in that eerie silence that comes when people realize the ground under them, literally and figuratively, isn't theirs. I stood quietly, letting the reality sink in. Then I said, "I didn't steal your homes. Your HOA built them on my land. You've all been living in the wrong place." A woman near the front burst into tears. Others started shouting at Klein, demanding answers. The meeting descended into chaos. Lydia leaned over and whispered, "Let's go. They'll tear each other apart from here." As we left, a few people followed us out, not to yell, but to quietly ask what would happen next. Lydia told them honestly, "You'll need to negotiate with my client if you want to stay." That night, my phone blew up. News reporters, homeowners, even county officials wanted statements. Lydia told me to say nothing. "Let the headlines do the talking," she said. The next morning, they did. Front page, HOA president under fire after developer builds neighborhood on wrong land. Below that, a picture of Robert Klein looking like he'd swallowed a lemon. I didn't even have to lift a finger. The HOA was crumbling from the inside out, but Lydia wasn't done. "We've got one more step before checkmate," she said. "Next week we file for damages, and that's when they'll realize you weren't bluffing." By the time Lydia filed the quiet title action, the entire town knew my name, and the HOA's empire was starting to collapse under its own arrogance. The headlines wouldn't stop. County error leads to $40 million land dispute. Homeowners fear eviction over mapping fiasco. Every night, I'd turn on the news and see drone footage of those same houses gleaming in the sun, houses that legally sat on my soil. Lydia warned me not to let the attention get to my head. "Stay calm," she said. "The HOA will try one last stunt before they break." And she was right. A week later, I got a certified envelope from their new legal team. Apparently, they'd fired Benton after his meltdown in court. The letter accused me of unjust enrichment and claimed I'd deliberately allowed development to proceed to extort the association. I almost laughed out loud. Lydia just smirked and said, "Perfect. That means they've admitted they built on your land." She filed our response the next morning, a 200-page counterclaim for trespass, land conversion, and unlawful enrichment, demanding not just the return of the land, but damages for every square foot used without consent. The amount? $12.7 million. "That'll get their attention," Lydia said dryly. And it did. Within 48 hours, Robert Klein himself called my cell phone. "We can make this go away," he said, his voice trembling between anger and desperation. "You name a number, we'll cut you a check." I told him, "It's not about money anymore." He scoffed. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're ruining people's lives." I paused, then said quietly, "You ruined them yourself when you stole my land." He cursed and hung up. A few days later, the county commissioners held an emergency meeting, trying to mediate a deal before the lawsuit went nuclear. Lydia and I attended, but it was a circus. Developers blaming surveyors, surveyors blaming the county blaming system errors. Everyone had an excuse, but none of them mattered. The law was simple. The land was mine. At one point, a commissioner asked if I'd consider donating the land to the HOA to restore community harmony. Lydia nearly choked on her water. "You want my client to gift 20 acres and a decade of his life to cover up your corruption?" she said. The room went dead silent. "That's not negotiation," she added. "That's blackmail." The meeting ended in chaos, cameras flashing, reporters shouting. From that moment, the county switched tactics. They started offering backdoor deals, promising tax breaks or compensation packages if I'd sign over partial rights. Lydia's advice was simple: don't take the bait. The longer they squirm, the more leverage we have. So we waited. Meanwhile, the homeowners started turning on the HOA board. Videos of angry residents shouting at meetings went viral. "You lied to us!" One woman screamed at Klein in a clip that got millions of views. Lawsuits began flying in every direction. Homeowners suing the developer suing the county threatening to sue the GIS contractor. Lydia called it legal Armageddon. For me, it was vindication. Still, not everything felt like victory. One afternoon, as I stood on the ridge overlooking the neighborhood, a man in his 50s approached me. He introduced himself as Paul, one of the homeowners. "Look," he said, "I know the HOA's rotten, but we didn't know. We bought these houses fair and square." His voice cracked a little. "We've got kids. We just want to stay." I looked at him for a long time before answering. "You're not the problem, Paul," I said. "But the people who built your home knew exactly what they were doing." He nodded slowly, resigned. I guess we all got played. That conversation stuck with me. I told Lydia about it, and for the first time, her tone softened. "You're allowed to have empathy," she said, "but don't let it make you weak." A week later, we were back in court. This time, the judge's chambers were filled with attorneys from every side, stacks of binders piled like fortresses. The county's lawyer tried to argue that equitable relief should allow the HOA to retain the land if they compensated me for the value at the time of development. Lydia shot that down instantly. "They didn't just trespass," she said. "They built 96 structures, laid pipes, and sold land they didn't own. That's not an accident. It's organized fraud." The judge listened carefully, tapping his pen. Then he looked at the HOA's counsel. "How did this happen?" he asked. No one answered. Finally, Benton, who had slinked back in as a consultant, muttered, "A GIS mapping error." The judge frowned. "A $40 million mapping error?" You could hear a pin drop. That's when Lydia went for the jugular. "Your Honor, my client has been more than patient." He gave them every chance to correct this privately. They chose deceit instead. "We're requesting immediate transfer of title and a full audit of all related permits and financials." The judge nodded slowly. "So ordered." And just like that, the HOA lost its grip. Overnight, my ownership of the land was reaffirmed and registered with the state. Every mortgage attached to those lots was frozen. The developers' bank accounts were locked pending investigation. Klein tried to save face with the media, calling it a temporary misunderstanding, but the footage of him dodging reporters went viral within hours. He looked like a man watching his kingdom burn. Lydia wasn't celebrating yet, though. "We still have the damages hearing," she reminded me. "That's where they'll feel the real pain." And she wasn't kidding. Over the next month, forensic accountants tore through the HOA's financial records. What they found made the land dispute look almost small. Kickbacks from contractors, inflated invoices, personal consulting fees paid to board members. The place was a swamp of corruption. Lydia compiled everything into a single, brutal summary and handed it to the state attorney's office. "You wanted justice," she told me. "Now you're about to get it." By the time the next hearing rolled around, half the HOA board had resigned. The remaining members sat in court pale and sweating while Lydia presented her final argument. This wasn't a mistake. This was greed wearing the mask of authority. And now it's time they pay for every inch of stolen ground. When she finished, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge leaned forward, looked directly at Klein, and said, "I've seen incompetence before, but this is deliberate. Prepare to compensate the rightful owner in full." He banged the gavel, and that was it. The HOA's empire cracked in half. As we walked out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed us again. One asked, "Mr. Hayes, what will you do with the land now that it's legally yours again?" I looked out at the flashing cameras, thought about my father's old hayfields now buried under cul-de-sacs, and said simply, "I'm still deciding. But whatever I do, it won't include an HOA." Lydia laughed under her breath. "You just made a lot of enemies and a few thousand fans." She was right. Because while the legal war was ending, the public one was just beginning. When the gavel fell that day, I thought the war was over, but in reality, it was only entering its loudest chapter. News of the ruling exploded across every platform like wildfire. Local outlets ran continuous coverage, and national media picked up the story within 48 hours. "HOA builds entire neighborhood on the wrong man's land," read one headline. Another blared, "Developer faces multi-million-dollar judgment after illegally constructing 96 homes." Reporters camped outside the courthouse, trying to get sound bites from anyone connected to Oak Ridge Meadows. It wasn't long before the story became less about land and more about corruption, greed, and small-town arrogance. Lydia warned me. Enjoy it, but stay quiet. The more they talk, the worse it gets for them. And she was right. Within days, financial auditors discovered that the HOA's development funds had been siphoned into private accounts belonging to board members, including Robert Klein himself. The FBI got involved, followed by state investigators, and suddenly this little local mess had turned into a full-scale criminal probe. I remember standing on my porch one morning, coffee in hand, watching black SUVs roll into the subdivision below. Agents in windbreakers with Department of Justice printed across their backs were knocking on doors, seizing computers, and collecting boxes of documents. It was surreal. The same people who'd mocked me for months were now watching federal officers tear through their office files. By noon, Klein was in handcuffs. His smug expression from all those HOA meetings was gone, replaced by a pale, hollow stare. The news captured every second of it. The man who'd built his reputation on controlling others now being escorted out of his own subdivision. The irony was delicious. Lydia called me that night. "Congratulations," she said. "You just became the face of property rights reform." Apparently, lawmakers were already talking about introducing new legislation to prevent this kind of mapping fiasco from happening again. But while the internet was cheering me on, I wasn't celebrating. I kept thinking about the homeowners, families who'd just wanted a nice place to live and were now stuck in the mess their HOA had created. I decided to meet with a few of them quietly. One evening, I arranged a sit-down at a diner in town with 6 homeowners who'd reached out personally. They were nervous, apologetic, even embarrassed. A woman named Lisa spoke first. "We didn't know," she said. "They told us everything was approved. We paid our dues, followed every rule." Another man added, "We've got our life savings tied up in those homes. Please tell us we're not going to lose them." I took a deep breath and said, "You're not my enemies. The people who built your neighborhood on lies are. As long as you're willing to negotiate fairly, I'll make sure you're protected." Their eyes filled with relief. That meeting became the start of something bigger. Lydia helped me draft new agreements, giving each homeowner the option to lease their land directly from me until the legal restructuring was complete. It wasn't about profit. It was about principle. "You just turned your enemies into allies," Lydia said afterward. "That's how you win a war permanently." Meanwhile, the court's damages hearing arrived, and it was a spectacle. The HOA's new legal team came armed with excuses, begging the judge for leniency, claiming bankruptcy. Lydia was merciless. "My client has been vilified, threatened, and robbed," she said. "They built a town on his property, then painted him as a villain. The only thing that stopped them was being caught." She presented detailed valuations, construction costs, and lost use calculations that totaled nearly $13 million in damages. The HOA's lawyers tried to argue that compensating me would devastate innocent homeowners, but the judge wasn't swayed. "The responsibility lies with the developers and board members who knowingly proceeded without ownership verification," he said. "The law doesn't protect fraud." When he ruled in my favor again, granting full damages plus interest, Lydia squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "You just bankrupted an empire." It didn't feel real until I saw the aftermath. Oak Ridge Development went under almost overnight. Their offices shuttered, their projects halted, their website went dark. Klein and 2 board members were indicted for fraud, falsification of public records, and embezzlement. Even the county faced lawsuits for negligence and tampering. It was a domino effect of poetic justice. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 2 weeks later, when I drove past the subdivision and saw something new at the entrance. The fancy Oak Ridge Meadows sign was gone, replaced by a temporary wooden board reading, "Property under new management." I stopped the truck, rolled down the window, and just sat there for a while, taking it all in. The place that had once symbolized everything wrong with greed and bureaucracy now stood as proof that persistence still mattered. Later that month, Lydia and I were invited onto a morning news show to discuss the case. Sitting under those bright studio lights, I was nervous. But the host's first question made me laugh. "Mr. Hayes, what was going through your mind when you realized they built 96 houses on your property?" I thought for a second, then said, "That I should probably start charging rent." The audience laughed, but the message was serious. "This wasn't about money," I continued. "It was about standing up to people who think they're untouchable. Afterward, messages poured in from around the country. Homeowners, small farmers, veterans, even retirees, all thanking me for proving that regular people could still beat powerful institutions. Lydia's inbox exploded with new cases, and she began forming a coalition of attorneys to challenge similar injustices. She called it the Property Defense Network. "Looks like we started something bigger than us," she told me one night over the phone. "Good," I said. "Maybe next time people will think twice before stealing someone's land." But even as the legal victories piled up, I felt something shift inside me. Revenge had carried me this far, but now it was time for closure. I started visiting the property again at sunrise, the same ridge where my father used to stand with his old binoculars. The subdivision sat quiet below, houses lined neatly under the morning mist. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger when I looked at them, only peace. The fight was over. The land was still mine, and soon it would become something new entirely. After all the noise, lawsuits, and headlines faded, silence returned to my land, the kind of silence that feels earned, not given. For months, the subdivision below sat in limbo while the county, the courts, and the new management company worked out legal restructures. The families who chose to stay signed land lease agreements under my ownership, turning what was once stolen into something lawful and fair. Others, exhausted by the chaos, moved away. Slowly, the place transformed. The HOA was gone, dissolved, dismantled, erased from county records like it had never existed. The once proud Oak Ridge Meadows was reborn under a new name the homeowners chose themselves, Hayes Ridge. They said it was their way of honoring me, though I never asked for it. Lydia found it poetic. "You turned the villain's castle into your monument," she said with a smirk. I told her I didn't care about monuments. I just wanted the truth to stay on paper where no one could twist it again. But deep down, I'll admit, it felt good driving past that new sign for the first time. The same road that had once been guarded by security gates and HOA warnings now had a simple wooden welcome board that read, "Respect the land and each other." I couldn't have written better words myself. The state's criminal cases went forward fast. Klein and two of his board members took plea deals, admitting to fraud and falsification of records. Each got time in federal prison, while the county's GIS manager quietly resigned before charges could drop. Oak Ridge Development filed bankruptcy, its CEO disappeared overseas, and the rest of the company assets were auctioned off to pay restitution. Lydia made sure every penny of my awarded damages came through. She even hand-delivered the final check with a grin. "You could retire on this," she said. I just laughed. "Retirement doesn't suit me." "I've got better plans." She raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" That's when I told her. I wanted to rebuild what my father had once dreamed about. Not rows of homes, not corporate expansion, but something real. A memorial park dedicated to landowners who'd lost property to fraud, eminent domain, and bureaucratic theft. A place to remind people that ownership still meant something. Lydia stared at me for a moment, then smiled softly. "That's the most satisfying revenge I've ever heard." Over the next 6 months, I hired crews to clear the undeveloped section of the ridge and plant longleaf pines, wildflowers, and native grasses. The air smelled like freedom again, fresh soil and sawdust instead of diesel and asphalt. A small walking trail wound through the hills, ending at a simple bronze plaque mounted on a stone from our old barn foundation. It read, "For those who refuse to be erased." The opening day drew more people than I expected. Families, veterans, even homeowners from Hayes Ridge who brought picnic blankets and kids who played tag through the field. Lydia stood beside me as the local news cameras rolled. "You know," she whispered, "you could run for county commissioner after this." I laughed. "No thanks. I've seen enough politicians to last a lifetime." But what she said next stuck with me. "You didn't just win back land, Garrett," she said. "You changed how this county works. You reminded people that rules are supposed to protect, not punish." She was right. Within months of the case closing, the state passed a new law requiring every county to double verify property boundaries before approving construction. They called it the Hayes Act. When I first read the name in the paper, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. My father would have been proud. As time went on, life found its rhythm again. I spent most mornings walking the ridge trail with a cup of coffee, watching fog roll between the rooftops of Hayes Ridge below. The homeowners who stayed had built something better, a community without the arrogance of an HOA board. They held meetings under open tents, voted fairly, helped each other instead of fining each other. A young couple even invited me to their baby's christening, calling me the man who gave us our home twice. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just smiled and brought a fruit basket. Every so often, reporters would try to reignite the story, asking if I'd forgiven the people responsible. I always gave the same answer. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about owning what's yours and not letting it define you anymore. A few years passed and the media moved on. Lydia opened her own firm specializing in property rights. We stayed friends. She'd drop by sometimes to talk law, drink coffee, and remind me how close we'd come to losing everything. One afternoon, she handed me a leather-bound folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, court transcripts, and the original deed that started it all. "Keep it safe," she said. "This story's going to outlive both of us." She was right again. Word of my case spread through law schools, community forums, even real estate seminars. People studied it as an example of what can happen when regular citizens fight back, not with anger, but with patience, proof, and persistence. The irony never left me. The HOA that tried to bury me under paperwork ended up buried under its own. Every time I saw one of those old Oak Ridge houses with kids playing in the yard, I didn't feel bitterness anymore. I felt proud. Not because I'd beaten them, but because I'd proven that justice still existed somewhere beyond the politics and greed. On the one-year anniversary of the case's conclusion, the Homeowners Association of Hayes Ridge invited me to a barbecue on the green. No gates, no rules, no power trips, just neighbors enjoying the land that had nearly torn them apart. As the sun dipped behind the pines, one of the residents clinked a glass and called for a toast. To the man who saved our homes and reminded us what community really means. Everyone raised their cups toward me, and for once I didn't deflect or downplay it. I just nodded and said, "To the land, and may it never be stolen again." The crowd cheered. The children laughed, and as twilight settled over the ridge, I looked around at everything that had come from one long, brutal fight. A fight I never asked for but refused to lose. When the stars came out, I walked the trail one last time, past the plaque, past the oaks we'd planted where the bulldozers once roared. The night air was cool, the world finally quiet. I thought about my father, about the years of neglect, the lawsuits, the fear, the victory, and then, with a slow breath, I smiled. Because for the first time in a long time, the land was exactly what it was meant to be. Mine, peaceful and free.